we're going to look at the Enlightenment culture. So during the 16 through 1800s, we're going to look at the changes in art and music. So, to begin with, the 16th, 17th, and 18th century brought many changes in the arts, literature, and political philosophy. Now, we're going to look more at the philosophy part when we do your project this week, but we're going to mainly look at the art and literature today, including music. So, new artistic movements. So we left off with art with the Renaissance, and the Renaissance revived Greek and Roman styles, right? Now, the new movement is going to be the Baroque movement. Now, Baroque emphasized grandeur and power, right? And so you can see this is an example of Baroque architecture, and this is a palace in Austria, and it is massive, right? It's meant to emphasize grandeur, or, like to be huge. It emphasizes power, right? Also think of the Palace of Versailles, right? That is also Baroque architecture. Now, oftentimes, but not always, Baroque architecture tends to be religious, especially in the church. Baroque would make influences in the Catholic Church. The new style, besides Baroque, would eventually be neoclassical. So we're going to see it's kind of like a new Renaissance type of situation. So neoclassical emphasizes classical work, so Greek and Roman. So it's kind of like the Renaissance point two, right, or the second wave of the Renaissance. So for instance, by the time that neoclassical is taking way, in the 1700s and into the 1800s, we in America are building our own government buildings because we are now independent, right? And so the example here that I gave you is the Capitol building from DC. So that is America's capital. That is neoclassical, right? The white stone. We also see columns, right? Rotundas, okay? Very reminiscent of Greek and Roman styles. You also have an emphasis, for example, Baroque would make its way into the Trevi Fountain. This is a fountain in Rome, which is a major tourist attraction. You can go to Rome. It's pretty cool. I've actually been there. And so the story goes that, according to legend, that if you turn around and you drop a coin in the fountain behind your back, then you're destined to return there. Right? But there is Baroque style. There's some neoclassical influences here, and that's in Rome. Art, in terms of art, painting would depict classical subjects, like we saw with the Trevi Fountain, for instance. That was Poseidon and Greek mythology. You do have public events. For example, the painting here shows basically like some kind of picnic or some kind of like outdoor event, right? And so we do also see natural scenes. A lot of nature is going to be painted, and even living people. So this is the era where portraits become a big thing again. One of the most famous painters that you have to know is Eugene Delacroix. Delacroix was a painter who would create the transition from from Renaissance through the Baroque into what we call the Romantic school of the 19th century, which would be the later 1800s. And so the Romantic school would emphasize more of like a romantic ideal, or like the perfect ideal of what society might look like. Now, in terms of music, you do have Johann Sebastian Bach. Bach is Baroque. You do have to know Bach and Baroque, so B and B is usually how I remember it. Bach is known for many things, including his most famous being Mass in B minor. So remember, we talked about Baroque being an influence in religion, and so the Catholic Church would basically use Baroque art, Baroque music, in their churches, in church services, in order to entice people to come back to the Catholic Church, to show them that they're changing, because this is at the tail end of the Protestant Reformation, and so the Catholic Church is trying to show people that they are changing. The next composer that you have to know, or musician, is George Friedrich Handel. Handel is a Baroque composer, and he is known for his Hallelujah Chorus, which is part of his overall piece of music called Messiah. And so basically, this again is a religious type of music. So this is church music, basically. Right? We often think of the Hallelujah Chorus and the Messiah around Christmas time. Now, we're going to transition from Baroque to classical, and there are some differences between Baroque and classical. Baroque is a lot of church music, right, with religious purposes for the church, but by the time you get to people like Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, Mozart is classical. And there's some differences in the musical styles. There's differences in the types of instruments that they use. Right? By the time you get to the classical music, you're basically going to see not only woodwinds, like the flute and other things like that, but you're also going to see, things like string instruments, the violin, for instance. Compared to Baroque, Baroque is a lot of organ and piano type music. And so Mozart is famous for a lot of things, including his Magic Flute, the Marriage of Figaro. So basically classical music is opera music, and so classical music, including things like the Marriage of Figaro, the Magic Flute, what you see is it's music, but it's set to a story. So it's not just music per se, but it's music that's supposed to tell a story. So there's a story that goes along with it. And so, for instance, the Marriage of Figaro tells the marriage of a guy named Figaro. And then one of the most famous classical composers that we all know is Ludwig van Beethoven. And Beethoven was classical. He wrote many things, including Moonlight Sonata, his Symphony No. 5, right? And so these are some of his most famous ones. And again, there's piano music, but there's also string instruments as well as other kinds of instruments. And the differences between Baroque and classical also have to do with how many instruments are going, how many sounds you hear at the same time. Now, transitioning from art and music, we're going to look at writing. So one of the most famous pieces of writing of the time came from a guy called, his name was Miguel de Cervantes. Cervantes was Spanish. He was a novelist, meaning he wrote a novel. So the novel is a new type of literature that was developed. So it's not just scholarly writing, government writing, church writing. Now we have a novel that tells a story. So Miguel de Cervantes' novel, the first novel, was Don Quixote. And Don Quixote tells the story of a Spanish peasant, basically, who thinks he's a knight, and he basically goes around trying to save damsels in distress, right? And so he basically, in trying to save them, he's like hallucinating the whole thing. So oftentimes he sees windmills as giants and monsters, and there are damsels in distress, women who need to be saved, and he just is hallucinating the whole thing. And of course he has a sidekick with him who tries to keep him grounded in reality, Sancho Panza. But Don Quixote is his name, the name of the novel and the main character.